Hey guys, tonight we are going on a trip. Not to a calm, sun-drenched beach or a quiet forest, but somewhere else. We're traveling back in time to 19th century London, and our first stop isn't a grand palace or a famous landmark, but the simple act of taking your first breath in that world. A word of warning, it's an experience. The air itself is a historical document, and honestly, you might find the smell alone is a bigger threat than anything else. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel find more people like you who enjoy these late-night historical drifts. While you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't a sight, but a smell. It's thick, complex, and it clings to the back of your throat. Imagine the air as a heavy, damp woolen blanket that's been soaked in a cocktail of coal smoke, horse manure, and something vaguely, unpleasantly fishy. That's your welcome to the greatest city in the world. You're standing on a muddy cobblestone street. The fog here isn't the clean, mysterious mist of a fairy tale, it's a pea souper. A yellowish-brown shroud laced with soot from a million chimneys. Every breath you take feels gritty. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and London is its roaring, smoke-belching heart. The sky, even on what should be a clear day, is a permanent shade of grey. A canvas for the endless plumes of black smoke rising from factories and homes. You start walking, carefully trying to avoid the murky puddles that dot the uneven street. The sound is a constant, low-level roar, the clatter of iron-shod wheels on stone, the rhythmic sea-lopping of countless horses, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the ceaseless hum of human voices. But it's the smell that keeps pulling your attention. It's layered. The dominant note is coal, but underneath it, there's the sharp, ammonia-like tang of horse urine, with a horse population estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The streets were essentially open-air stables. Then, as you get closer to a bustling market, new scents join the chorus: sawdust from a butcher's shop, roasting nuts, stale beer wafting from a pub doorway, and the undeniable odor of unwashed humanity packed tightly together. Now here's a little detail that's easy to forget before the invention of modern sewage systems. The River Thames was London's main artery and its primary sewer. Everything industrial waste, human waste, slaughterhouse runoff, everything ended up in the river. So that faintly fishy smell adds the ghost of a river gasping for air. In the summer of 1858, the problem got so bad it was nicknamed the Great Stink. The heat wave baked the river's contents into a truly monumental stench, so overpowering that it was said to have forced Parliament to consider abandoning London altogether. They even tried draping the windows of the Houses of Parliament with curtains soaked in chloride of lime. A primitive attempt to mask the smell. It didn't really work. This leads us to a core belief of the time, the miasma theory. Before germ theory became accepted, most doctors and scientists believed that diseases like cholera and the plague were spread by miasma, or bad air. This wasn't a completely crazy idea. After all, poor, smelly, overcrowded areas were where disease was most rampant. It made a certain amount of sense to connect the foul odor with the sickness itself. So to you, standing in this thick, soupy air, every whiff feels like a gamble. You instinctively pull your collar up over your nose, a futile gesture that the locals would probably find amusing. To them, this is just the smell of home. And this is where historians still have a lively debate. We can scientifically analyze what created the smells we know about: the coal, the lack of sanitation, the industrial processes. But what is still argued about is the subjective human experience. How much did the average Londoner actually notice the smell? Were they so acclimated to it that it just became background noise, like the traffic hum of a modern city, or was it a constant, low-grade source of misery and anxiety. Some letters and diaries from the period complain bitterly about the stench, while others don't mention it at all, focusing on other daily struggles. Reconstructing the sensory world of the past isn't just about listing the ingredients of a smell, it's about trying to understand how it felt to live inside it. A puzzle that we can never truly, completely solve. For now, you just stand there, taking it all in, a traveler not just in time, but in a whole different realm of sensation. This city, in all its grimy, smelly, vibrant glory, is the world that shaped our story, and it shaped the man we're here to meet. That smell we were talking about. No thick, chemical soup you're breathing into the people around you. It isn't just unpleasant, it's a potential killer. This is the world of the miasma theory. And it colors everything about how you perceive your own body and its fragility. You watch a well-dressed woman hold a perfumed handkerchief to her nose as a carriage splashes mud near her. It's not just about protecting her expensive dress in her mind. She's warding off cholera. You see herbs hanging in doorways, not for decoration, but as a fragrant shield against airborne disease. Every unexplained fever, every stomach cramp, every lingering cough is a potential sign that you've inhaled a fatal dose of bad air. Let's put you right in the middle of it. As you step back to avoid a speeding cart, your foot slips on a grimy stone. You put a hand out to cut yourself, scraping your palm against the rough brick of a wall. It's not a deep cut, just a nasty graze. Today, you'd barely think about it. You'd wash it, put on a bandage, and forget it existed by supper time. But here, now that small, bleeding scrape on your hand is a ticking clock. You look down at it. A few flecks of dirt are embedded in the wound. Your first instinct is to find some clean water, but the very concept of clean water is relative. The water from the local pump might be teeming with invisible dangers, far worse than the dirt you can see. For a moment, you feel a genuine spike of fear. People die from this. A simple cut gets inflamed, the arm swells, a fever sets in, and a few days later, you're just another statistic. Sickness isn't a rare event here, it's a constant, hovering presence. Life is a lottery, and your health is the ticket you're clutching, hoping your number isn't called. So what are your options? You could visit an apothecary, a shop filled with jars of dried herbs, strange tinctures, and leeches swimming in a jar on the counter. He might sell you a poultice of questionable ingredients to draw out the impurities. If you have the money, you could see a physician, but even that is a gamble. A university-educated physician might look at your hand, pontificate wisely about the imbalance of your humors, and prescribe something both expensive and utterly useless, like a change in diet or, famously, bloodletting to remove the excess blood that is surely causing the problem. And this brings us to a fascinating and slightly stomach-turning little tidbit from the era: the concept of laudable pus. If your wound were to become infected, which is highly likely, and start to ooze thick, white or yellowish pus, many surgeons of the time would see this as a good sign. Laudable means praiseworthy. They genuinely believed that the formation of pus was the body's natural way of expelling the toxins and impurities that caused the illness in the first place. So you could be in the early stages of a fatal staph infection, but your doctor might be patting you on the back, telling you everything is healing splendidly. The very thing that would send a modern doctor into a panic was, to them, a sign of recovery. It's a perfect example of how, without an understanding of germs, everything was interpreted through a completely different, and tragically wrong, lens. This is where you find one of the big arguments among medical historians. Just how much faith did the average person place in these professional doctors? Was it only the rich who could afford their often harmful advice, while the poor were left to their own devices, or was there a more complex system at play? Some historians argue that there was a deep-seated and quite sensible distrust of official medicine. Many people, particularly in rural areas, but also in the city, would have relied more on folk remedies passed down through generations, herbal infusions, specific wraps, or traditional salves. These treatments, developed through centuries of trial and error, might have been ineffective, but they were often less actively harmful than a doctor draining half your blood supply. The debate continues over whether this was a clear class divide, the rich getting bad scientific advice and the poor getting ineffective folk wisdom, or if people from all walks of life mixed and matched, trying a bit of everything in a desperate attempt to stay alive. You decide to take your chances. You wipe your hand on a piece of cloth you hope is relatively clean and try to ignore the stinging. But for the rest of the day, you're acutely aware of it. Every throb, every twinge of pain, sends a little jolt of what if through your mind. You are living without a safety net. There are no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no real understanding of infection. Your own immune system is your only defense, a lonely soldier fighting a war against an invisible, unknown enemy. It's this constant, low-level dread, this knowledge of how easily a life can be snuffed out, that forms the backdrop for our story. It explains why people were willing to endure almost anything, even the horrors of the operating theatre, if it offered even a sliver of a chance at survival. So you're walking around London, hyper-aware of the scrape on your hand, trying not to touch anything. You're beginning to understand the pervasive fear of illness and injury. But what if your problem was more serious than a graze? What if you had a bladder stone causing you agony? Or a tumor growing on your jaw? Or a leg that was so badly broken it was turning black? In that case, you wouldn't be going to a university-educated physician. You'd be sent to a surgeon. And in the 19th century, that was a very different thing. Today, we see surgeons as the pinnacle of the medical profession, highly trained specialists. But back then, the lines were much blurrier, and the history of surgery was, shall we say, a bit more hands-on and a lot less prestigious. You look around the bustling city streets and see signs for all sorts of trades. You pass a barber shop, and through the window, you see a man in a chair getting a shave. But the red and white pole outside tells a more complex story. That pole is a historical remnant. The red represents blood, the white represents bandages. For centuries, the local barber was also your local surgeon. They were the ones you went to for bloodletting, for pulling a rotten tooth, for lancing a boil, or for a minor amputation. It was a trade, a craft learned through apprenticeship, not a scholarly pursuit. While physicians were at universities studying Hippocrates and Galen, talking about the four humors and diagnosing ailments by inspecting a patient's urine, the barber surgeons were the ones actually cutting into people. They were seen as skilled manual laborers, on a social par with a butcher or a carpenter. And, in a way, the comparison to a butcher wasn't entirely unfair. The core skills were similar: a steady hand, a strong stomach, and a deep, practical knowledge of anatomy, not from a book, but from the act of cutting. You can almost feel that social distinction in the air. A physician, with his fine clothes and cane, would likely look down his nose at a surgeon, who was more likely to have his sleeves rolled up and actual blood on his apron. The two professions were governed by different bodies: the Royal College of Physicians for the doctors, and the Company of Barber Surgeons for the cutters. They were separate worlds. One dealt in theory and diagnosis, the other in steel and flesh. And while this separation had started to break down by our period, with surgery gaining more respectability, that old stigma of being a glorified tradesman still lingered. This brings us to a weird little fact of the era: the tools of the trade. You pause to look in the window of a shop that sells surgical instruments. They look less like medical devices and more like something from a medieval torture chamber or a carpenter's toolbox. You see saws that look exactly like smaller versions of what you'd use to cut wood. There are large, curved knives that resemble small scimitars. They are heavy, brutal-looking forceps for crushing bladder stones. These weren't delicate instruments for precise work. They were tools designed for force and speed, for cutting through bone and flesh as quickly as humanly possible. There was no time for finesse. The tools reflected the job. It was a violent, desperate business. This is where you find a fascinating debate among historians about the evolution of the surgeon's identity. When did the surgeon stop being a butcher and start being a healer? In the public imagination, some argue it was the rise of great anatomical schools in the 18th century, where surgeons like William Hunter began to elevate their craft to a science. Others insist the real turning point wasn't until the arrival of anesthesia and antiseptics. They argue that as long as surgery was a brutal, screaming ordeal with a 50% chance of death from infection, no amount of anatomical knowledge could erase the public perception of it as a form of butchery. The argument is still alive. Was the change in status due to the surgeons' own efforts to professionalize? Or was it entirely dependent on the technological breakthroughs that finally made their work survivable? As you walk on, you notice a well-dressed man step out of a carriage. He's tall, imposing, and moves with an air of immense confidence. He doesn't look like a stuffy physician, and he certainly doesn't look like a humble barber. He carries a small, leather-bound case, and people on the street seem to recognize him, nodding with a mixture of awe and fear. This, you sense, is the new breed of surgeon, a man who has transcended the role of the tradesman, a man who has turned the brutal craft of the knife into a form of high-stakes performance art. He is not just a cutter, he is a star. This is the world that created men like Robert Liston, men who could wield a butcher's knife with the flair of a concert violinist, and whose operating rooms were about to become theaters in every sense of the word. The imposing man you saw, but star surgeon, HES heading towards one of London's great teaching hospitals. Out of a morbid curiosity you can't quite suppress, you decide to follow him. You find yourself joining a crowd of young men, all buzzing with anticipation, heading up a steep flight of stairs. The air grows thick with the smell of carbolic acid and unwashed bodies. You're not heading into a sterile, quiet ward, you're heading into a theater. You push your way through a set of swinging doors and the scene that unfolds before you is startling. You are in a semicircular room, with rows of steep wooden benches rising up around a central stage. It's built like a university lecture hall or a small amphitheater, but the focus isn't a lectern nor a podium. It's a simple, sturdy wooden table, heavily stained with dark, dry patches from countless procedures before. On a small side table, an array of polished steel instruments is laid out, glinting under the light from a large overhead skylight. The room is already packed. Students, fellow doctors, and even curious members of the public are crammed onto the benches, jostling for a better view. The atmosphere is not one of solemn medical procedure, it's electric, like the moments before a prize fight or a dramatic play. This is the surgical operating theater of the pre-anesthetic era, and it was, quite literally, a theater. Surgery was a public spectacle. For the medical students, it was a vital part of their education. Seeing a master at work was how you learn it. For visiting doctors, it was a chance to witness new techniques. But for the others, the layman who sometimes managed to get a seat, it was a form of gruesome entertainment, a thrilling brush with mortality. You can hear the low murmur of the crowd, people placing informal bets on how long the patient will last, or how quickly the surgeon will finish. It feels profoundly, uncomfortably public. Now imagine the patient. They would be carried in, fully conscious, their eyes wide with terror. There's no gentle preamble, no soothing words from a nurse. They would be laid down on that hard, unforgiving table. Strong men, usually hospital porters or junior students, would be tasked with holding them down, one for each limb, one for the head. Their only job was to restrain the patient, to stop them from thrashing, screaming, or fighting their way off the table during the agony that was to come. You, sitting in the stands, can see the raw fear on the patient's face, can hear their desperate pleas. There is no privacy, no dignity. Their most vulnerable moment is a public performance. Here's a curious little detail that highlights the theatrical nature of it all. In some of these older operating theaters, there was a layer of sawdust spread on the floor beneath the table. This had a very practical purpose: to soak up the blood. During a major operation like an amputation, there would be a lot of it. The sawdust made the floor less slippery and made the cleanup afterwards slightly easier. But it also added to the strange, butcher shop aesthetic of the whole affair. A surgeon might finish a procedure, his boots covered in bloody sawdust, looking more like he'd just finished a shift at an abattoir than at a hospital. It's a stark reminder that cleanliness, as we understand it, was not a priority. The speed of the operation was everything. The very design of these theatres is a point of contention for architectural and medical historians. Was the theatrical design purely for educational visibility, allowing the maximum number of students to see the procedure, or did it serve a more subtle psychological purpose? Some historians argue that the public, performative nature of the surgery was a way of legitimizing it, by making it a spectacle. Surgeons were demonstrating their confidence and skill, turning a terrifying ordeal into a display of mastery. It was a form of medical branding. Others, however, believe this design actively worked against medical progress, prioritizing the surgeon's performance over the patient's well-being and delaying the shift towards the private, sterile environments we know today. The debate centers on whether these theaters were a necessary educational tool or a monument to surgical ego. You look from the terrified patient on the table to the surgeon, who is now calmly selecting his first knife. He doesn't speak to the patient. He addresses the audience. He might hold up the diseased limb for all to see, explaining the necessity of the procedure in a loud, clear voice. He is the star of this show. The patient merely a prop in his drama. The crowd leans forward, a collective hush falling over the room. The show is about to begin. And in this theater, the main source of drama, the quality that everyone is here to see, the attribute that will define the surgeon as either a master or a hack, is one thing and one thing only: speed. The air in the operating theater crackles with anticipation. The patient is strapped down, the surgeon has his knife, and the audience is silent. Why is everyone so fixated on the clock? You're about to find out. In a world without anesthesia, every single second that a patient is on the operating table is a second of pure, unadulterated agony. Speed wasn't just a matter of showing off, it was the most fundamental form of mercy a surgeon could offer. The faster the operation, the less time the patient spent screaming. It was that simple. But it went deeper than that. The prevailing medical wisdom of the day linked prolonged pain directly to a patient's chances of survival. The concept was known as surgical shock. They believed that the sheer trauma of the pain itself could kill a person, overwhelming their nervous system and causing their body to simply give up. A patient could die from the shock of the operation, even if the procedure itself was technically successful. So, a surgeon who could complete an amputation in 3 minutes was considered vastly superior to one who took 15, because his patient was thought to have a much better chance of surviving the initial shock. You're about to see this philosophy in action. The surgeon gives a sharp nod. The assistant stents, tightening their grip on the patient's limbs. The man on the table lets out a strangled cry, and then the surgeon moves. It's not a delicate, careful process. It's a blur of controlled violence. The knife cuts through skin and muscle in a single, fluid stroke. There's no time for careful dissection or gentle handling of tissues. The goal is to get to the bone as quickly as possible. The patient's initial cry turns into a continuous, horrifying scream that echoes through the theater. It's a sound that seems to fill every inch of the room, a raw expression of suffering that you feel in your bones. But no one seems to be paying it much mind. Their eyes are all on the surgeon's hands. He drops the knife, and it clatters onto the side table. An assistant immediately hands him a saw. The grating, rasping sound of the saw cutting through bone is somehow even worse than the screaming. It's a visceral, industrial noise that has no place in a room dealing with human life. But again, the surgeon is incredibly fast. A few powerful back and forth strokes, and it's done. The severed limb is unceremoniously dropped into a bucket with a sickening thud. The whole process, from the first cut to the final saw, might have taken less than 2 minutes. The audience murmurs in appreciation. They've just witnessed a masterclass in speed. Now, here's a little known consequence of this need for speed. Surgeons often held the knife in a very peculiar way. To save precious seconds, some surgeons would hold the bloody amputation knife in their teeth while they reached for the saw. Imagine the scene: the surgeon, his face splattered with blood, leaning over the screaming patient, with the very instrument he just used clenched between his teeth like a pirate. It's an image that is both comically macabre and a testament to the extreme pressures they were under. Every saved second was a victory, and no action was too strange if it shaved a moment off the total time. This obsession with speed is a major point of discussion for medical historians. Was this focus on celerity a genuine, evidence-based medical necessity, or was it a form of surgical machismo that ultimately did more harm than good? Proponents argue that, given the reality of surgical shock and the absence of pain relief, speed was the only ethical approach. A fast surgeon caused less pain and gave the patient a better chance. However, critics argue that this obsession led to recklessness. In the rush to be the fastest, surgeons were more likely to make mistakes damaging major arteries, cutting nerves, or leaving behind splintered bone fragments that would guarantee a fatal infection. They contend that a slightly slower, more careful approach might have actually improved outcomes, even if it prolonged the patient's immediate suffering. It's the classic debate: was it a life-saving skill or a deadly performance? The surgeon is now quickly lighting the arteries, tying them off with sutures to stop the bleeding. An assistant is preparing a hot iron for cauterization, ready to sear the wound shut. The patient's screams have subsided into weak moans. The whole brutal, bloody affair is almost over. You look at the clock on the wall. It's been less than 5 minutes. To you, it felt like an eternity. To the patient, it was a descent into hell. But in the world of 19th century surgery, it was a success. The speed was dazzling, the technique decisive. The surgeon wipes his hands on his already blood-soaked apron and gives a slight bow to the appreciative audience. And as you watch him, you realize you're looking at one of the superstars of this terrifying art form, a man whose name was synonymous with speed. A man named Robert Liston. The crowd begins to disperse, buzzing with chatter about the procedure you just witnessed. You hear his name spoken in tones of reverence and awe. Liston. Robert Liston. As you make your way out of the hospital, you see him again, now standing on the steps, speaking with a few colleagues. He doesn't look like a butcher, and he doesn't look like a monster. He looks like a man completely in his element. Let's get a proper introduction. Robert Liston was, in many ways, larger than life. He was a big man, standing around 6'2", which was unusually tall for the era. He was described as having a powerful, athletic build and an abrupt, no-nonsense demeanor. In a profession that was starting to attract more refined, gentlemanly types, Liston was a throwback to the older, more rugged school of surgery. But with the skills of a modern master, he was born in Scotland in 1794, the son of a clergyman and inventor, and he seemed to inherit both his father's intellect and a fierce, unshakable self-confidence. You can see that confidence in the way he stands, the way he commands the space around him. He wasn't known for his bedside manner. In fact, he was notoriously short-tempered and abrasive. He had little patience for incompetence and was known to get into fierce arguments with his colleagues, whom he often viewed as timid, slow, and overly academic. To Liston, surgery wasn't about scholarly debate in a drawing room, it was about decisive action in the operating theatre. He was a man of action, not words unless those words were being used to scathingly criticize another doctor. He earned his reputation in Edinburgh, but it was in London, where he became a professor of clinical surgery at University College Hospital in 1835, that he became a true legend. This was the big lead, and he arrived with the reputation already preceding him. He was known as the fastest knife in the West End. Patients, despite his gruff nature, flocked to him, because when you are facing the surgeon's knife without anesthetic, you don't care if the man holding it is charming. You care if he is fast, and Liston was the fastest. His speed was legendary. There are accounts of him completing a leg amputation in 2.5 minutes. Some stories, likely exaggerated over time, claimed he could do it in as little as 28 seconds from the first incision to the final cut of the saw. While that number is almost certainly a myth, it speaks to the perception of his abilities. He moved with a speed and precision that other surgeons could only dream of. He was so fast that his assistants barely had time to react. He would turn and say, "Time me, gentlemen," and the whirlwind would begin. Here's a small, telling detail about his character. Liston had a genuine, deep-seated hatred of the quacks and snake oil salesmen who preyed on the sick and desperate. While he could be arrogant and dismissive towards his professional peers, he reserved a special level of contempt for those who offered false hope and bogus cures. There are stories of him publicly exposing charlatans and warning patients away from their useless and often dangerous remedies. This reveals another side to him. His arrogance wasn't just about ego, it was rooted in a profound belief in the power of legitimate, skillful surgery and a disdain for anything that wasn't honest and effective. He was arrogant because he believed he was, quite simply, the best hope a patient had. This duality is a source of ongoing debate for historians and biographers of Liston. Was he primarily a showman, a man who loved the roar of the crowd in the operating theatre and cultivated his larger-than-life persona for fame, or was he a deeply committed, if difficult, medical pioneer whose primary motivation was always the well-being of his patients? Some historians point to his public feuds and his theatrical time-me, gentleman catchdraws as evidence of a massive ego. Others focus on his numerous innovations and his tireless work in the hospital, arguing that his gruff exterior hid a genuine desire to save lives and advance his craft. The truth, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a complex man living in a brutal time, a product of an era that demanded its surgeons be part performers, part saviors. As you watch him from a distance, you see him laugh, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He claps a colleague on the shoulder with a hand that looks strong enough to snap a board into the same hand that, just minutes ago, moved with the swift, deadly grace of a striking snake. You are looking at the undisputed king of his profession, a man at the absolute peak of his powers, a man for whom speed is everything, and it is this very obsession with speed, this defining characteristic of his genius, that will eventually lead to his most infamous and most tragic legacy. Your gaze lingers on Liston, this giant of the surgical world. You start to notice the details of his appearance, not just his imposing stature but his professional attire. And what you see is, by modern standards, utterly horrifying. He's not wearing a sterile white coat or disposable scrubs. He's wearing his street clothes, a dark waistcoat and trousers, and over them, a heavy, green woolen coat. This isn't a fresh coat he put on for the surgery. It's stiff with the dark, dried stains of countless previous operations. It's his badge of honor. This was the surgeon's uniform. In an era before germ theory, the idea of washing a coat between operations would have seemed absurd, even wasteful. A blood-caked coat was a sign of experience. It told the world that you were a busy, sought-after surgeon who saw a lot of action. Junior doctors and students looked at a coat like Liston's with aspiration. It was a visible resume, a testament to a surgeon's prowess and the sheer volume of his work. He would likely wear this same coat to see patients in the wards, to walk down the street, and perhaps even to sit down for dinner later. The concept of cross-contamination was completely unknown. You lean in a little, trying to get a better look at the tools he carries. His assistants are carefully wiping them down, but not with alcohol or any kind of antiseptic. They're likely just using a bit of water and a cloth, before placing them back into a velvet-lined wooden case. The instruments themselves are beautiful in a terrifying way. They were often custom-made, with handles of ivory or polished ebony. A surgeon's set of tools was a significant personal investment and a source of great pride. Liston himself was known for a particular knife that bore his name, the Liston knife. It was a long, thin, double-edged blade, designed for amputations. It was sharp on both sides, allowing him to make sweeping cuts through skin and muscle with incredible speed, changing direction without having to turn the knife in his hand. It was an instrument built for pure, unadulterated velocity. Looking at it, you can understand how a man could get through a limb in under a minute. It was an extension of his own philosophy: direct, efficient, and brutally fast. And here's a bizarre and slightly gruesome tidbit about surgical practice at the time: the use of ligatures. These were the threads used to tie off arteries and stop the bleeding. They were often made of silk or linen. After tying off a vessel deep inside a wound, the surgeon would leave the long ends of the thread hanging out of the patient's body. The wound would then be bandaged up with the threads still dangling out. The idea was that, after a few weeks, the ligature would hopefully rot away from the artery and the surgeon could simply pull it out. This practice, of course, provided a perfect pathway for bacteria to travel directly into the wound, practically guaranteeing infection. A patient might survive the surgery only to die weeks later when the surgeon gave a gentle tug on the suture and caused a catastrophic internal bleed or raging infection. This brings us to one of the most enduring puzzles for historians of medicine: the psychological denial of the obvious. Surgeons saw patient after patient die of what they called hospital gangrene or puerperal fever. They knew that certain hospitals, and even certain wards within hospitals, had much higher death rates than others. Yet, the connection between the surgeon's unwashed hands, his dirty coat, his contaminated instruments, and the subsequent deaths of his patients was almost never made. Why historians have debated this for decades. Was it a simple lack of a scientific framework, making the concept of invisible germs literally unthinkable, or was it a more complex form of professional blindness? Some argue that to accept such a reality would be to accept that they, the surgeons, were the primary agents of death for their own patients, a psychological burden perhaps too great to bear. They were saving people from the immediate threat of a gangrenous slim or a tumor, and the subsequent fever was seen as a separate, unavoidable tragedy, a whim of fate or bad air. Liston, confident and proud in his blood-stiffened green coat, is the perfect embodiment of this contradiction. He was a brilliant anatomist and a supremely skilled technical surgeon. He was at the absolute forefront of his field, and yet, he was, like all his contemporaries, unknowingly a carrier of death. He would wash his hands after an operation, to clean them, but rarely, if ever, before. HED select his beautiful, expensive, and thoroughly contaminated instruments, lay them on an unsterilized side table, and proceed to save a life with one hand while potentially dealing a death sentence with the other. You watch him close his instrument case with a satisfying click. He is ready for his next challenge, completely unaware of the invisible world of microbes he carries with him. A world that will ultimately prove far more deadly than any knife. Let's not just talk about Liston's speed, let's put you back in the stands to witness it in all its terrifying glory. This isn't the infamous operation we're building towards. Not yet. This is a routine day for Liston. A chance to see the master at work on a standard, yet horrifying, procedural leg amputation above the knee. The patient, a young man with a leg crushed by a wagon wheel, has already been brought in. The air is thick with the same tension as before. The man is pale, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the sea of faces staring down at him. He is utterly alone in his terror. Liston enters the theatre, not with a slow, dramatic pace, but with a brisk stride that radiates purpose. He doesn't waste a moment. He nods to the students, a curt acknowledgement of his audience, and then his entire focus narrows to the task at hand. He says his famous line, "Time me, gentlemen," and you can almost hear 100 pocket watches click open in the stands. The assistants, who have worked with Liston before, know the drill. They brace themselves, their knuckles white as they pin the man to the table. Liston takes his eponymous knife. For a split second, there's a perfect, terrible silence. Then, he begins. The first movement is a flash of steel. Liston doesn't tentatively probe, he commits. In one long, sweeping up, his knife slices through the skin and muscle of the thigh, circling the entire leg. It's a move of shocking speed and precision. The patient's scream is instantaneous and deafening, but Liston is already moving on. He drops the knife, it clatters on the tray, and in the same fluid motion, HES grabbing the saw, an assistant is holding ready. There is no wasted energy, no hesitation. He places the saw against the exposed femur. The assistants have to redouble their efforts now, as the patient, driven by instinct and agony, thrashes against their grip. The sound of the sawn bone is sickening. The rough, wet, grating noise. But it's mercifully short. Liston's powerful arms drive the saw back and forth with incredible force. Wood, bone, it makes no difference to a man with his strength. In what feels like maybe 10 or 15 seconds, the bone is severed. The leg comes free. An assistant catches it before it hits the floor and quickly places it in the waiting bucket. The entire amputation, from the first cut to the leg landing in the bucket, has taken less than a minute. The crowd murmurs, impressed. But it's not over. The most dangerous part is yet to come, stopping the bleeding. The femoral artery, now severed, is pumping blood in powerful jets, spraying the floor and the front of Liston's coat. He works with a focused intensity, using forceps to quickly grasp the ends of the spurting arteries. An assistant hands him ligatures, and with deft, practiced movements, he ties them off. He works without panic, a calm island in a storm of blood and screams. And this is where we encounter a strange little piece of medical lore from the time the tourniquet debate. Tourniquets were, of course, used to restrict blood flow to the limb before amputation. However, some of the fastest surgeons, Liston allegedly among them, sometimes worked with a loosened tourniquet or none at all. Why would they do this? The theory was that if the arteries were allowed to bleed freely, they would be easier to see and grab with the forceps after the amputation. A constricted artery might retract into the muscle tissue, making it difficult to find and leading to a deadly internal bleed later. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It meant more blood loss during the surgery, but potentially a more secure closure of the vessels afterward. It was a choice that perfectly encapsulated the surgical mindset of the Arab Bowl. Dangerous gamble for a better outcome. Now for the final touch. An assistant brings forward the cauterizing iron. Its tip glowing red-hot from a nearby brazier. Liston takes it and presses it against the smaller, oozing vessels that are too small to tie off. The smell of searing flesh fills the air, mingling with the coppery scent of blood. The patient, who had faded into moaning, finds the strength for one last, sharp shriek of pain. Then, finally, it's quiet, save for the patient's ragged breathing. Historians and surgeons today still marvel at the sheer technical skill this required. How did they achieve such accuracy at that speed? Under such pressure, the debate often centers on the role of anatomical knowledge. Liston was just a fast cutter. He was a brilliant anatomist. He had an intuitive, three-dimensional map of the human body in his head. He knew precisely where every major nerve and blood vessel was without needing to see it. He wasn't cutting blindly, he was cutting with a deep, instinctual knowledge was his success. Therefore, a testament to his innate talent, or to the rigorous, dissection-based training he championed. Scholars argue it was the combination of the two, the physical prowess of an athlete combined with the encyclopedic knowledge of a scholar, creating a surgical force of nature. Liston finishes dressing the stump with simple linen bandages. He straightens up, looks at the clock, and gives a satisfied nod. 2.5 minutes. A miracle of speed. A testament to his skill. The patient is alive. He has survived the ordeal. For now, he has been saved from the gangrene. But he still has to survive the next great challenge, the almost inevitable post-operative infection. But in the theater, in this moment, Liston is a hero. The students are applauding. You, sitting in the stands, feel a strange mix of horror and profound respect. You have just witnessed the best-case scenario in 19th century surgery. A brutal, bloody, but ultimately life-saving masterpiece. As the applause from the students subsides and the patient is wheeled out, still moaning, you are left to process what you've seen. It was undeniably impressive. A life was saved. And yet, something about it feels deeply unsettling. The line between masterful surgery and reckless endangerment seems incredibly, dangerously thin. And you're not the only one who feels this way. Even in his own time, Robert Liston was a deeply polarizing figure. While the students and the public might have adored his theatrical speed, many of his professional colleagues were less than impressed. You can imagine the conversations happening in the more sedate, respectable halls of the Royal College of Physicians. They would have seen Liston not as a savior, but as a showman, a usher who prioritized the spectacle over the patient's long-term well-being. His famous speed, to them, was just a euphemism for carelessness. Their argument would have been this in his rush. What was Liston missing? Was he leaving behind tiny splinters of bone in the stump, which would become a focus for infection? Was he accidentally snipping a crucial nerve that might leave the patient with a lifetime of pain? Assuming they survived, was his swift ligation of the arteries truly secure, or was it a hasty job that might fail in a few days, leading to a fatal hemorrhage to these more conservative surgeons? A procedure that took 10 minutes but was done with meticulous care was far preferable to Liston's 2-minute whirlwind. They accused him of playing to the gallery, of turning a sacred trust between doctor and patient into a macabre sporting event. And they had a point. The pursuit of speed could, and did, lead to mistakes. Liston's career, for all its brilliance, was dotted with anecdotes of procedures that went horribly wrong in his haste. One of the more famous, and arguably more verifiable, stories involves the amputation of a leg where Liston was moving so quickly that he accidentally amputated the patient's testicles as well. The patient reportedly survived the leg amputation but died later of infection, which was a common outcome regardless. But the story stuck. A cautionary tale whispered among his rivals about the dangers of unchecked celerity. This brings us to a weird, specific complaint from the era fancy cutting. This was a derogatory term used by more traditional surgeons to describe what they saw as unnecessarily showy techniques. For example, a surgeon might use a flourish of the knife or a particularly rapid method of dissecting tissue that looked impressive to students but offered no real medical benefit, and might even increase the risk. Liston, with his signature moves like the single sweeping cut to encircle a limb, was the prime target for such accusations. His critics saw it as pure theater. To them, the goal wasn't to look cool, it was to be safe. This conflict highlights a central debate among medical historians about the nature of surgical progress itself. What truly defines a good surgeon in a pre-modern era? Is it the one with the best statistics, the lowest immediate mortality rate on the table? If so, Liston, by minimizing surgical shock, was arguably one of the best. Or is it the surgeon whose patients have the best long-term outcomes, with fewer complications and infections? The problem is, we simply don't have the data to answer the question definitively. Hospital records from the 19th century are notoriously incomplete and unreliable. We have the legends, the anecdotes, the published papers, but we don't have the hard numbers that would allow for a fair comparison between the slasher and his more methodical, slower colleagues. Did Liston's speed save more people from shock than it condemned to death by a hasty mistake? We can't be sure. And historians continue to argue, re-examining letters, casebooks, and memoirs to try and build a case for one side or the other. So you're left with two competing images of the same man. On one hand, you have Robert Liston, the hero, the fastest knife in the West End, a surgical demagogue who snatched patients from the jaws of death when no one else was brave or fast enough to try. On the other hand, you have Robert Liston, the reckless show-off, a man whose ego and love of applause potentially endangered the very people he was trying to save. Both versions are probably true. He was a man of profound contradictions, perfectly suited to a profession that was itself a contradiction, a life-saving act that was indistinguishable from a violent assault. His confidence was both his greatest asset and his most dangerous flaw, and it was the supreme, unshakable confidence in his own speed and skill that would set the stage for the most notorious day of his entire career. Your mind is still buzzing with the contradictions of Liston's character as you wander away from the hospital. To distract yourself, you find yourself peering into the windows of shops that cater to the medical trade. And what you see is a cabinet of curiosities, a collection of tools that underscores the brutal, mechanical nature of 19th century medicine. It's not just the saws and knives, it's the specialized equipment, each designed to solve a specific, gruesome problem. In one window, you see an instrument that looks like a cross between a drill and a corkscrew. This is a tray fine. Its purpose was to bore a hole into a patient's skull to relieve pressure on the brain. A procedure known as trepanation that has been practiced since ancient times. Imagine a surgeon, with no anesthetic, hand cranking this device into someone's head. The line between a life-saving procedure and a fatal injury was measured in millimeters of bone. A slip of the hand meant instant death. Next to it is something that looks even more intimidating, a lithotrite. This was a tool for dealing with bladder stones, a common and excruciatingly painful ailment. The lithotrite was a long, steel instrument that was inserted up the urethra and into the bladder. Once there, the surgeon would use a screw mechanism at their end to open a set of jaws at the other end, grasp the stone, and then crush it. The fragments would then hopefully be passed out with the urine. It was an internal demolition job, performed blind, on one of the most sensitive parts of the body. The risk of perforating the bladder or causing a massive infection was enormous. Liston himself was considered a master of this procedure, known for his ability to get in, crush the stone, and get out with his characteristic speed. But perhaps the most bizarre looking to Lucy is the tonsil guillotine. Yes, you read that right. Before the more delicate snare method was common, removing tonsils was often done with a device that looked remarkably like the infamous instrument of the French Revolution, only miniaturized. It had a ring that was placed over the tonsil, and then a sliding blade was pushed forward, slicing it off in one go. It was quick, efficient, and utterly terrifying, especially since the procedure was often performed on conscious children. This brings us to a fascinating and slightly disgusting tidbit: the use of the surgeon's own fingernails. Before the widespread adoption of specific tools for every job, a surgeon's hands were his primary instruments. A particularly telling example is in the procedure for bladder stones, but the one where you cut into the perineum to extract a lithotomy. Some surgical manuals from the period instructed the surgeon to grow the nail on their left index finger long and sharp. This nail would then be used as a probe to feel for the stone and guide the cutting instrument that bore it into the bladder. It was a perfect example of the whatever works mentality of pre-modern surgery, where the surgeon's own body became part of the toolkit, with no concept of the bacteria a long fingernail might harbor. These strange and brutal tools highlight a major point of debate among historians of technology and medicine. How much did the tools themselves doctor surgical innovation, versus how much did surgical techniques drive the invention of new tools? It's a chicken and egg scenario. Did a surgeon like Liston invent a faster knife because he wanted to be faster? Or did the availability of steel and craftsmanship allow him to develop faster techniques? Some historians argue that the Industrial Revolution, with its advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, was the single biggest driver of surgical change in this period. The ability to create stronger, sharper, and more reliable instruments opened up possibilities that simply didn't exist before. Others argue that the tools were secondary. They contend that the real driver was the surgeon's will and anatomical knowledge. A master like Liston, they argue, could have achieved similar results with inferior tools, and that the instruments were merely refinements of techniques he had already perfected. The question remains, was the hero the surgeon or the toolmaker? As you turn away from the shop window, you have a new appreciation for the physicality of the job. It wasn't just about knowledge, it was about brute force. It was about having the strength to saw through a femur, the dexterity to crush a stone you couldn't see, and the nerve to use tools that looked like they belonged in a workshop. Every instrument told a story of a specific type of human suffering and the violent, desperate attempt to relieve it, and it reinforces the idea of the surgeon as a master craftsman, a man who knew his tools intimately. For Liston, his knives and saws were not just instruments, they were extensions of his will, the means by which he imposed his speed and skill upon the chaotic reality of the human body. Leaving the intimidating display of surgical tools behind, you continue your walk through the grimy London streets. You have seen the spade, the skill, the spectacle, and the terrifying instruments. But now, Let's talk about the ghost at the feast. The invisible enemy that haunted every single one of those operations. It was the killer that followed the patient out of the operating theater and into the recovery ward. It was far more deadly than any surgeon's knife. We're talking about infection. To the people of this era, it was a complete mystery. A patient could have a successful surgery, the tumor removed, the leg amputated, and seemed to be recovering well for a day or two. Then, the inevitable would begin. A fever would set in. The wound site would become red, swollen, and excruciatingly painful. A foul-smelling pus would begin to seep from the bandages. This condition had many names: hospital gangrene, pymia, septicemia, but they all described the same grim, predictable decline. The patient would become delirious, their body racked with chills and sweats, until they finally succumbed. You find yourself passing the open door of a hospital ward. You peek inside. The sight is grim. The beds are crammed close together, just a few feet apart. The air is stale and smells of sickness and unwashed linen. A nurse, overworked and exhausted, moves from bed to bed, but she isn't acting as a medical professional in the modern sense. Her job is primarily to provide comfort, to change soiled bandages, and to offer a sip of water. She has no tools to fight the real enemy. Imagine you are one of the patients in that ward. You've survived Liston's knife. The initial, searing pain of the operation is fading, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache from your stump. You feel a cautious optimism. You made it. But then you look at the man in the bed next to you. He had an operation a few days ago, too. Now he is shivering uncontrollably under his thin blanket, his face flushed with fever, muttering incoherently. You see the doctor come, look at him, shake his head grimly, and walk away. You know, with a cold certainty, that you are likely looking at your own future. The ward wasn't a place of healing, it was a waiting room for death. The mortality rate from post-operative infection in some big city hospitals was staggering, sometimes as high as 80% from major amputations. And here's a particularly strange and tragic piece of the puzzle: the belief in good and bad pus. We touched on laudable pus earlier, the thick, creamy pus that was seen as a sign of healing. But surgeons also recognized other kinds. A thin, watery, foul-smelling discharge was considered bad pus and was known to be a sign of impending doom. They could differentiate between the two. They knew one was associated with recovery, or so they thought, and the other with death. But they had absolutely no idea why. They were observing the different effects of Staphylococcus and Streptococcus bacteria without having any concept of their existence. They were like ancient astronomers charting the movement of stars, seeing the patterns, but having no understanding of the gravitational forces that governed them. This complete inability to understand infection is perhaps the most frustrating what-if in medical history. The debate among historians here is intense. How close were they to figuring it out? Some scholars point to figures like Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna, who, in the 1840s, demonstrated that if doctors washed their hands in a chlorine solution before delivering babies, the mortality rate from puerperal fever plummeted. He had the data, he had the proof, but he was ridiculed and professionally ruined. His colleagues found the suggestion that they, the gentlemen doctors, were carrying some cadaveric material on their hands to be personally offensive. The resistance was not scientific, it was social and psychological. Historians argue endlessly about this. Was the failure to adopt Semmelweis's findings a result of pure arrogance? A lack of a plausible scientific explanation? He didn't know why it worked, only that it did. Or just simple institutional inertia? It's a tragic story of a discovery made too soon. A hint of the truth that was ignored because the world wasn't ready to hear it. So, for now, in our story, the killer remains invisible. Surgeons like Liston would perform their brilliant, rapid operations, and then hand the patients over to this terrible lottery. Their success or failure was, in the end, completely out of their hands. It didn't matter how fast the knife was if the wound festered a week later. This shadow of infection looms over everything Liston does. It adds a layer of tragic irony to his famous speed. He was racing against the clock to save his patients from the shock of the knife, all while unknowingly introducing them to a much slower, more insidious killer. He was the best in the world at winning the battle, but he had no weapons to fight the war. And it's this grim reality that provides the backdrop for the one operation where everything that could possibly go wrong did. Let's turn our attention away from the surgeon for a moment and focus on the other side of the equation. Let's think about the person who was about to become the central figure in our infamous story, the patient. We don't know his name. History, which lionizes men like Liston, rarely remembers the names of the people they operated on. He is an anonymous figure, a stand-in for every terrified person who ever lay on that wooden table. So let's imagine him. Maybe he's a dock worker, a man who makes his living with the strength of his body, or perhaps a clerk, a man whose life is quiet and sedentary. It doesn't matter. What matters is that something is terribly wrong with his leg. Maybe it's a tumor, a grotesque swelling that has grown steadily, turning his limb into a painful, useless burden. Or maybe it's osteomyelitis, a deep, rotting infection in the bone that has resisted every poultice and prayer. For months, he has lived with escalating pain, sleepless nights, and the dawning, horrifying realization that he is going to die if this thing isn't removed. His decision to submit to surgery is the absolute last resort. He has heard the stories. Everyone has. He knows about the screaming. He knows that many who go into the operating theatre are carried out only to die a few days later in the fever ward. To agree to this is an act of supreme desperation. It's choosing a slim chance of survival over the certainty of a slow, painful death. Picture him in the days leading up to the operation. He says his goodbyes to his family. These are not hopeful, see you soon farewells. They are fraught with the very real possibility that this is the last time they will see him alive. He puts his meager affairs in order. He lies awake at night, his diseased leg throbbing, his mind racing. He tries to imagine the pain. He tries to steel himself for it, to build up a wall of courage, but he knows, deep down, that no amount of mental preparation can truly ready him for what is to come. On the day of the surgery, he is brought to the hospital. The sounds, the smells, the sight of other sick and dying patients, it all serves to heighten his terror. He is given a swig of brandy or whiskey, not enough to dull the pain, but perhaps just enough to take the edge off his fear, or maybe just to stop him from bolting. Then, he is led towards the theatre. As he walks through those doors and sees the steep banks of spectators, his heart must sink. His most private moment of agony and fear is to be a public show. He is laid on the table. The wood is hard and cold against his back. It's stained with the blood of those who came before him. He looks up at the skylight, then at the faces staring down at him, a mixture of clinical curiosity and morbid excitement. He feels the strong hands of the assistants grab his arms and his good leg. They are not gentle. Their grip is firm, impersonal. He is no longer a person, he is an object to be restrained, a problem to be fixed. And here's a small, poignant detail about the patient experience: the sound. Before the surgery even began, a patient would often be able to hear the surgeon in an adjacent room, testing the edge of his knife or saw on a piece of leather or wood. Imagine lying there, strapped to a table, and hearing the shing of a blade being sharpened, or the rough sets of a saw being tested, the sounds of the very instruments that are about to be used on you. It's a form of psychological torture that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. This patient-centric view has become increasingly important to medical historians. For a long time, the history of surgery was written from the surgeon's perspective, a story of great men and their great achievements. But in recent decades, there has been a push to write a history from below, to try and reconstruct the experience of the anonymous patient. What did they feel? What did they think? It's a difficult task, as their voices are rarely preserved in the historical record. Historians have to piece it together from surgeons' case notes, which often describe the patient's screams or struggles, from letters, and from the occasional diary. They debate how much agency a patient actually had. Did they have any say in their treatment? Or were they simply passive recipients of the doctor's authority Reconstructing this lost perspective is an ongoing, vital project to create a more complete and compassionate understanding of medical history. So there he lies. Oh man. He sees the giant figure of Robert Liston enter the room. He has heard the name. The fastest knife in the West End. This is supposed to be a comfort. This is the man who can get it over with quicker than anyone else. But looking at the imposing surgeon, his blood-stained coat, and the cold steel instruments on the tray, it's unlikely he feels any comfort at all. He closes his eyes. He says a silent prayer. He braces himself. The star of our show is ready. The audience is waiting. And our unlucky patient is at the epicenter of what is about to become the most disastrous surgical performance in history. You're back in the stands of the operating theater. But this time, the atmosphere feels different. But it's charged with a higher voltage. Maybe it's the way Liston carries himself today, an extra swagger in his step, an almost electric confidence radiating from him. Or maybe it's just the benefit of hindsight. The knowledge that you are about to witness something legendary. The patient is on the table, just as we left him. His knuckles are white where he grips the sides of the wooden plank. The assistants are in place, looking more like wrestlers than medical professionals. The crowd is packed in tight. A sea of faces craning for the best possible view. It's a full house. Liston thrives on this. The energy of the crowd fuels his own. He is, at his core, a performer, and this is his stage. He walks to the side table and surveys his instruments. The Liston knife, long and gleaming. The heavy amputation saw. The forceps and the ligatures. All are laid out with a stark, brutal cadence. He selects his knife, feeling its balance in his hand. He doesn't look at the patient's face. He looks at the leg. To him, at this moment, the leg is the only thing in the room. It is the problem, the antagonist in this brief, silent drama. The theater is a pressure cooker. For the students, this is a chance to see the master push the boundaries. They've seen his 2.5-minute amputations. The rumor spreading through the benches is that today, HE's going to be even faster, for his rivals and critics, who are undoubtedly also in the audience. This is another chance to find fault, to see his speed tip over into recklessness. They are watching not in admiration, but with a kind of clinical, judgmental scrutiny. And then there's the patient. For him, every second that passes is an eternity. The wait is a unique form of torment. He can't see much, lying flat on his back, but he can hear everything: the shuffle of feet on the wooden floor, the low murmur of the crowd, the clink of a metal instrument being moved on a tray. His senses are heightened to an unbearable degree. His heart is pounding against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down to the inevitable moment. Let's talk about a strange but very real part of this scene: the betting. It was not uncommon for spectators, and even students, to place wagers on the outcome of a surgery. It sounds appallingly callous to us, but it was a part of the culture of the time. They might bet on how long the procedure would take. I wager a shilling he does it in under 2 minutes. More grimly, on whether the patient would survive the table. This wasn't necessarily born of pure cruelty. It was, perhaps, a coping mechanism, a way of distancing themselves from the raw horror of what they were watching, turning it into a sport, a game of numbers and chance. It transformed the patient from a suffering human being into a variable in an equation. The existence and extent of this betting is a topic of some debate among historians. Was it a widespread, accepted practice, or was it a more rare and scandalous activity that was exaggerated in later accounts to make the errors seem more barbaric? Some sources, like the satirical cartoons and social commentaries of the day, depicted as commonplace. Official hospital records, of course, make no mention of it. So historians are left to read between the lines, trying to gauge the true moral atmosphere of the operating theater. Was it a place of ghoulish entertainment or a serious, if flawed, educational form? The answer is likely that it was both, often at the same time. Liston turns from his instruments and faces his audience. He holds up his knife. The light from the skylight catches the blade, It's a moment of pure theater. The room falls silent. The only sound is the patient's careful breathing. Liston is about to give his famous command, to start the clock on his race against pain. But this time, the race will have more contestants than anyone bargained for. The countdown has begun, not just for the patient, but for two other people in the room who have no idea that they are about to become collateral damage in the quest for ultimate speed. The pressure in the room is immense. Liston feels it. He thrives on it. But pressure can make diamonds, and it can also make things shatter. Your focus shifts from the patient and the surgeon to the other key players on this grim stage, the assistants. These are not trained surgical nurses as we would know them. They are often junior surgeons, students eager to get close to the master, or sometimes just sturdy hospital porters, chosen for their brawn rather than their medical knowledge. Their job is arguably one of the most difficult and dangerous in the room. There are several of them, strategically positioned. Two are on the patient's arms. Another is on his unaffected leg, and one has the critical task of controlling the hidden torso. Their sole function is to be human restraint. They are the living embodiment of the struggle against pain. They have to hold on, no matter what. If the patient thrashes and breaks free, he could inflict a worse injury on himself, or even knock over the surgeon at a critical moment. Their strength is the only thing ensuring the procedure can happen at all. Look at the face of the young man holding down the patient's right arm. He is a student. You can tell by his youth and his expression, which is a mixture of intense concentration and barely concealed fear. This is a coveted position. It means he is close to the action. He can see Liston's technique up close, but it's also terrifying. He can feel the patient's muscles tense and tremble under his hands. He can hear the man's whimpers and pleas right next to his ear. He has to steel himself against his own empathy to do his job. And his job is physically demanding. An adult in the throes of absolute agony can exhibit almost superhuman strength. The assistants have to anticipate the patient's movements, countering his desperate lunges. Their knuckles are white, their arms straining. A bead of sweat drips down the student's forehead. He's trying to watch Liston, to learn. But most of his being is focused on the simple, brutal act of holding on. Now let's zoom in on a particularly crucial assistant. This is the one whose job it is to hold and stabilize the leg that is about to be amputated. This is often a more experienced junior surgeon. He has to present the limb to Liston at the correct angle. He has to keep it steady during the initial cuts. And he has to be ready for the moment the saw cuts through the bone, making sure the limb doesn't fall awkwardly or cause the saw to bind. His hands are perilously close to the surgical field. He is literally holding the target. And here's a fascinating, if nerve-wracking, little detail about the life of a surgical assistant. They were often the first to be blamed if something went wrong. If a patient moved and a blood vessel was cut incorrectly, the surgeon might yell at the assistants for not being strong enough. If an instrument wasn't handed over quickly enough, they would bear the brunt of the surgeon's notoriously short temper. They lived in a state of high anxiety, desperate to please a man who was almost impossible to please, especially when he was in the zone, operating at breakneck speed. The relationship between a star surgeon and his dressers, as his assistants were sometimes called, is a subject of great interest to historians. Was it a mentorship, a master and apprentice relationship where knowledge was passed down through shared experience, or was it a more abusive, hierarchical system where the assistants were treated as little more than servants? The answer, as always, is complex and varied depending on the surgeon. Some accounts describe surgeons who took a genuine interest in their students' education. Liston himself, despite his temper, was a dedicated teacher. However, in the heat of the moment, in the high-stakes environment of the operating theater, praise was rare and sharp criticism was common. The psychological pressure on these young men was immense. They had to be perfect, invisible, and inhumanly strong, all at the same time. As Liston raises his knife, your eyes are drawn back to that assistant holding the leg. He is leaning in close, his fingers wrapped around the patient's thigh, just inches below where the first incision will be made. He is focused, ready. He has probably done this a dozen times before. He knows Liston's speed. He knows what to expect. Or so he thinks. He has no idea that in his dedication to his task, in his effort to provide the steadiest possible target for the master, he has placed himself directly in the path of the fastest knife in the West End. He is just another part of the scenery, another cog in the machine. But, in a few moments, he will be elevated from an anonymous assistant to a figure of legendary misfortune. The moment has arrived. The room is so quiet, you can hear the fizz of the gas lamps. The patient takes one last, shuddering breath. The assistants brace themselves. Liston, standing like a colossus over the table, has his audience exactly where he wants them in the palm of his hand. He is not just a surgeon, he is a conductor. And this is his orchestra of fear and steel. He surveys the rows of faces looking down at him. The students, eager and impressionable. The rivals, critical and jealous. He makes eye contact with a few of them, a silent challenge. He is about to demonstrate why he is the master. Why his name is whispered with a mixture of terror and awe throughout the medical schools of Europe. This is not just about saving the patient, it's about cementing his own legend. Then, he speaks. His voice is not a shout, but it's clear and powerful, cutting through the silence and reaching every corner of the theater. He says the two words that have become his trademark. The phrase that is both an instruction and a boast. Time me, gentlemen. It's an audacious move. It's a public declaration of his own confidence. He is not just inviting them to watch, he is inviting them to judge him on the one metric he values above all others: speed. It's a throwdown, a challenge to the clock itself. In the stands, you can see men flipping open the covers of their pocket watches, their eyes darting from the clock on the wall to the scene below. The countdown is official. This phrase, time me, gentlemen, has become almost mythical, synonymous with Liston himself. But why did he do it? What was the psychology behind this theatrical command on the surface? It's pure showmanship. It adds a layer of drama and excitement to the proceedings. It turns a medical procedure into a race, a sport. It's a way of hyping the crowd and focusing all attention on his virtuosity. But perhaps there was something deeper to it. It could have been a way for him to focus his own mind. By publicly starting the clock, he was creating an immense pressure on himself. A pressure that perhaps honed his concentration to a razor's edge. Like a sprinter waiting for the starting pistol. The command may have been the trigger that allowed him to enter that state of intense, almost unconscious, focus required to perform at such a high level. Here's a little-known fact that adds context to his confidence. Liston wasn't just a fast surgeon, he was an incredibly strong one. He was known to be able to amputate a leg with only one assistant holding the limb, while other surgeons often required 2 or 3. His physical strength allowed him to control the procedure in a way that others couldn't. He could power through bone and tissue with a force that compensated for any slight movement from the patient. So when he said time me, it wasn't just arrogance, it was a statement of fact based on his proven physical and technical superiority. The utterance of this phrase is a point of minor contention among Liston's biographers. Did he really say it before every major operation, as the legend suggests, or was it something he did only on occasion, which was then exaggerated over time to become his defining catchstraw? Some historians believe it was a regular part of his surgical performance, a key element of the Liston brand. Others think it's more likely an apocryphal detail, a story that was too good not to be told and retold until it became accepted as fact. Like much of Liston's life, the line between the man and the myth is blurry. But in our theater, tonight, the words had been spoken. The Hynenio, a promise of incredible speed. The patient flinches at the sound of Liston's voice. For him, those words are the tolling of a bell, the signal that his ordeal is about to begin. The assistant holding the leg gives it one last adjustment, making sure it's secure. He too is focused on the task, ready to play his small part in another of the master's lightning-fast triumphs. The men with the pocket watches have their thumbs on the start button. The stage is set. The clock is primed. Liston takes a half step forward, raises the long, gleaming knife, and the world seems to shrink to the space of that wooden table. The race against time is on. The moment the words "time me, gentlemen" leave Liston's lips, his body explodes into motion. This is not the careful, deliberate work of a modern surgeon. This is a whirlwind of controlled violence, a symphony of speed. You, in the stands, can barely follow the sequence of events. It's all a blur of flashing steel and desperate, thrashing movement. His first cut is the one he's famous for, a single, fluid, powerful stroke of the Liston knife. It slices through the skin, fat, and muscle around the patient's thigh, a deep, circular incision that leaves the white of the femur exposed. It's done in the blink of an eye. The patient's scream is a physical thing, a shockwave that hits the back wall of the theater, but Liston doesn't even seem to register it. HES already on to the next step. He drops the bloody knife onto the tray with a clatter. It's a sound the assistants are used to, the signal to have the next instrument ready. But Liston is moving faster than usual today. He seems to be operating on pure adrenaline, fueled by the pressure of the audience and his own immense self-confidence. He reaches for the saw, his movements sharp and economical. This is where things start to deviate from the plan, where the quest for legendary speed begins to unravel into chaos. In his haste to get the saw and begin cutting the bone, his flailing hand, still holding the bloody knife for a split second longer than it should have, makes an unintended movement. The long, wickedly sharp blade flashes through the air. The young assistant, the one holding the leg, is leaning in close, concentrating on keeping the limb steady, HES anticipating the force of the saw, not a stray flick of the knife. Before he can even react, the blade that just amputated the patient's flesh slices across his own hand. It's a deep gash, right through his fingers. He cries out in pain and shock, instinctively recoiling, his blood now mixing with the patient's on the floor. But Liston doesn't stop. He might not have even fully registered what happened. His focus is absolute. He has the saw now. He places it on the bone and begins to cut with his powerful, rhythmic strokes. The horrific, grating sound fills the room, momentarily drowning out the screams of both the patient and the now injured assistant. The bone severs with a final, sickening crack. The amputation itself is complete, from the first incision to the severing of the bone. It has taken a shockingly short amount of time, probably well under a minute. It is, by all accounts, one of the fastest amputations anyone in that room has ever seen. It's in this moment of chaotic triumph that the second accident occurs. Liston, finishing his sawing motion with a dramatic, forceful flourish, swings the heavy, blood-soaked saw backwards. His movements are big, expansive, designed for speed and power, not for working in a crowded space. Standing just behind him, leaning in to get a better view, is an elderly, distinguished-looking spectator. HES, one of the other surgeons, a colleague or perhaps a rival of Liston's. The backswing of the saw catches the man's coat. The sharp teeth of the blade rip through the heavy wool fabric. At first, it seems like just a close call, a torn coat. But the force of the swing, and the sharpness of the blade, is enough to inflict a gash. No one, not even the man himself, realizes the severity of it at first. In the confusion and noise, he simply stumbles back, clutching at his chest, a look of profound shock on his face. This brings us to a curious, if grim, piece of medical trivia: itogratenic injury, or harm caused by the heater. It was, of course, tragically common in the form of infection, but direct, physical injury from the surgeon was also a known, if unspoken, risk. In the cramped, chaotic conditions of the operating theater, with conscious patients thrashing and surgeons working at high speed, accidents were bound to happen. A misplaced cut, a slip of the knife — these were the occupational hazards of 19th century surgery. What makes this case unique is not that an accident happened, but the sheer, improbable cascade of them. Historians who analyze this event often debate the role of Liston's ego. Was this a case of simple, tragic misfortune, a freak accident, or was it the inevitable result of a man whose desire to perform, to be the fastest, finally pushed him over the edge from brilliance into unforgivable recklessness? Some defend Liston, arguing that, in the high-pressure environment of pre-anesthetic surgery, such events, while tragic, were understandable. They claim he was simply operating according to the standards of his time, where speed was paramount. Others, however, see this as a clear indictment of his entire philosophy. They argue that this single operation exposes the fatal flaw in his approach, that in racing against the clock, he abandoned his most fundamental duty to do no harm. In the theater, the immediate aftermath is a scene of utter confusion. The patient is bleeding on the table. The assistant is on the floor, clutching his mangled hand, and the elderly doctor is staggering away, a dark stain spreading across his waistcoat. Liston, his adrenaline still pumping, is focused on finishing the job, lightening the patient's arteries. He has just performed the fastest amputation of his life, a record-breaking feat. But the total cost of this new record is not yet clear. The clock is stopped, but the consequences are just beginning to tick. The main event, the amputation, is over in record time. But the surgery is not complete until the bleeding is stopped and the patient is bandaged. Liston, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he has just unleashed, turns his full attention back to the stump on the table. He is a man who finishes what he starts, with his characteristic speed. He begins clamping and tying off the arteries. Meanwhile, the theater is in a state of disarray. The injured assistant has been helped to his feet by other students. He is white as a sheet, staring in disbelief at his own hand. The wound is deep, severing tendons and likely damaging the bone. His dream of becoming a surgeon himself might have just ended. Ironically, at the hands of the very master he idolized. He is quickly led out of the theater, leaving a trail of blood drops on the floor. Your attention is then drawn to the other victim. The elderly doctor who was caught by the backswing of the saw is now being attended to by his colleagues. They'd helped him to a chair in the corner of the room. At first, they thought his coat had merely been torn, but as they open his waistcoat, the reality is clear. The saw didn't just rip the fabric, it sliced into him. It's not a deep wound, but it's a wound nonetheless, a dirty, ragged cut inflicted by a saw blade covered in blood and bone fragments from a diseased leg. In the midst of this, there's a new commotion from the public gallery. A man, a spectator in one of the upper rows, suddenly slumps over. His neighbor shakes him, then shouts for help. The man has fainted, or so it seems. In the pandemonium of the last few minutes, the screaming, the sight of multiple injuries, the sheer visceral horror of it all, the shock was simply too much for him. He has collapsed. This little detail, the fainting spectator, adds a layer of almost farcical darkness to the scene. Fainting was not uncommon in operating theaters. The combination of the heat, the smells, and the gruesome sights was enough to overwhelm even those with strong stomachs. It was a known hazard of attending such a performance. But in the context of everything else that is happening, it feels like the final, absurd cherry on top of a cake of pure disaster. So let's take stock of the situation. The patient's leg has been amputated in a time that will be spoken of for years. But in the process, the surgeon has also managed to wound his own assistant and a senior colleague. And the shock of the event has seemingly felled a man in the audience. It's a cascade of failure. A domino effect of disaster triggered by a single-minded obsession with speed. Liston finally finishes bandaging the stump. He straightens up, wiping his bloody hands on his even bloodier apron. It's only now, as the adrenaline begins to fade, that he can fully take in the scene of chaos around him. He sees his assistant being led away. He sees the commotion around his injured colleague. He hears the shouts about the man who has collapsed in the gallery, for perhaps the first time in his professional life. The swagger, the unshakable confidence, might be faltering. This is a key moment, one that historians can only speculate about. What was going through Liston's mind? Did he feel remorse, or was his first instinct a defensive anger? a frustration that these unforeseen complications had marred his record-breaking performance, given his notoriously thin skin and short temper. It's possible his first reaction was irritation rather than guilt. The historical records, filtered as they are through the lens of legend, don't give us a clear window into his emotional state. The debate continues: was he a man capable of recognizing his own fallibility? Or was his ego too large to admit such a catastrophic error? Some accounts suggest he was deeply affected by the incident, while others paint him as callously indifferent. The chaos in the room is a perfect illustration of the inherent dangers of pre-anesthetic surgery. It wasn't just the patient who was at risk. The entire room was a hazard zone. The assistants, the spectators, even the surgeon himself, everyone was participating in a high-stakes, high-risk activity with no safety net. There were no protocols for crowd control, no sterile fields, no sense of operational safety as we know it. This single operation encapsulates every single thing that was wrong with that system, all happening at once. It's a perfect storm of ego, speed, and unforeseen consequences. The knife has been put down. The saw is silent, but the damage is far from over. The immediate, bloody chaos in the operating theater begins to subside. The patient is carried out to the ward. The injured assistant is having his hand crudely bandaged. The elderly doctor is shaken but assuring his friends that the cut is minor. The spectator who collapsed has been carried out for fresh air. It seems, for a moment, that the incident, while shocking and embarrassing for Liston, might just end up as a wild piece of hospital gossip. A story about the day the fastest knife in the West End lost control. But the real tragedy of 19th century surgery rarely happened on the table. It unfolded slowly, quietly, in the days that followed. The true killer, as we know, was not the knife, but the invisible world of bacteria introduced by that knife. And in this case, Liston's chaotic surgery had spread that invisible killer with terrifying efficiency. Let's follow the three primary victims. First, the patient. He survived the operation, a feat in itself. He was taken to the ward, his stump bandaged, and for a day or two, he might have felt a flicker of hope. But the surgery was performed under grotesquely unhygienic conditions. The knife was unsterilized. Liston's hands were unwashed. The air itself was thick with pathogens. The outcome was grimly predictable. A few days later, the fever started. The stump became inflamed and began to ooze a foul-smelling pus. He had hospital gangrene, the dreaded post-operative infection. Despite surviving the shock of the world's fastest amputation, he could not survive its dirty aftermath. He died a few days later from sepsis. This was, tragically, the common outcome. That's death number one. Second, the young assistant. His hand was badly mangled by the Liston knife. The wound was deep, and, crucially, the knife that cut him was the same one that had just passed through the patient's diseased leg tissue. It was, in effect, a direct injection of the most virulent bacteria into his hand. His wound, too, became infected. The gangrene spread rapidly up his arm. In a cruel twist of irony, the aspiring surgeon found himself in the same position as the patients he had helped to hold down. An amputation of his own arm might have saved him, but the infection was too aggressive. He died a few days later, also from sepsis. That's death number two. Third, the elderly doctor in the crowd. His injury was the most freakish. The saw blade that had ripped his coat had been used to cut through a diseased bone, a likely source of rampant infection. The blade had only grazed him, and the cut was said to be minor, but it was enough. The wound, however small, was a doorway for the bacteria. He, too, developed a fever and fell ill. But here's where the story takes its most shocking and arguably most legendary turn. The man was so terrified by the event, so utterly horrified at the thought of being cut by that bloody saw, that he reportedly died from fright. He collapsed and died shortly after, not from infection, but from what was described as pure shock. His heart simply gave out. And this brings us to the final, morbid tally. 1 procedure, 3 deaths. The patient, who died of infection. The assistant, who died of infection. And the spectator, who died of shock. The patient went in for a surgery that was supposed to save his life. And instead, it led directly to his death and the deaths of 2 other people. This is how the legend was born, the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. Now that term, a 300% mortality rate, is, of course, a bit of black humor, a statistically nonsensical but grimly memorable phrase. Mortality rate is calculated based on the number of patients undergoing a procedure. Since there was only 1 patient, the direct mortality rate of the procedure was 100%, but the phrase 300% mortality rate captured the sheer, unprecedented scale of the disaster. It perfectly encapsulated the story of a surgery so calamitous it managed to kill not only the patient but also 2 other people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The death of the spectator from fright is a detail that has long fascinated medical historians and folklorists. Can a person literally be scared to death? The modern medical term would likely be stress-induced cardiomyopathy or a massive heart attack triggered by extreme psychological distress. It is a recognized, if rare, phenomenon. But whether this is what actually happened is a point of debate. Did he really die of fright, or did he, like the others, develop a fatal infection from the cut? With the fright narrative being a more dramatic and memorable explanation that was added to the story, later historians argue that the death by fright element adds a gothic, almost supernatural flavor to the tale, making it a more compelling legend. It elevates the story from a simple case of surgical malpractice to a quasi-mythological event. Whether every detail is precisely accurate or not, the outcome was the same. 3 men were dead. 1 operation had created a body count worthy of a battlefield skirmish. Liston's quest for speed had reached its logical, tragic, and utterly absurd conclusion. The story is simply too perfect. A world-famous surgeon, an obsession with speed, a chaotic operation, and a jaw-dropping 300% mortality rate. It's a tale that seems tailor-made for a grim bedtime story. And that's exactly why we have to ask the most important question of all: did it actually happen? This is where you, the time traveler, step out of the bloody operating theater and into the quiet, dusty archives of a historical library. The story of the 300% mortality rate surgery is one of the most famous anecdotes in medical history. It's recounted in books, lectures, documentaries, and countless articles. It's the go-to example of the horrors of Victorian surgery. But when you start trying to find the primary source, the original, verifiable account of the event, you run into a surprising amount of trouble. The story's most famous popularizer was a man named Richard Gordon, who wrote a book in 1947 called Doctor in the House, and later a historical work called Great Medical Disasters. Gordon was a doctor and a gifted storyteller, and his vivid, witty, and often gruesome retelling of this and other medical tales brought them to a wide audience. He presents the story as fact, and it is from his work that most subsequent retellings are derived. But Gordon was writing popular history, not academic history. He rarely cited his sources in a way that modern historians can easily trace. So the search continues. You look through the medical journals of the 1832 and 1842, like the Lancet. Surely, an event this catastrophic, involving a surgeon as famous as Liston, would have been reported. His rivals would have had a field day, writing scathing letters to the editor. His supporters would have written defenses. But as you scan the brittle, yellowed pages, you find nothing. There is no contemporary account of this specific triple fatality event. There are reports of Liston's other surgeries, debates about his techniques, and plenty of hospital gossip. But not this. This is the central problem. And the heart of the debate among medical historians: is the story true, or is it a brilliant piece of medical folklore? A fake lore that has been repeated so many times it has solidified into accepted history. Let's look at the arguments. The skeptics point to the complete lack of contemporary evidence. They argue that a story this dramatic would have left a paper trail. It would be in hospital records, in personal diaries, in letters between surgeons. The fact that it only seems to appear in print much later, in secondary sources like Gordon's, is highly suspicious. They suggest that the story is likely an amalgamation, a composite of several different accidents and rumors that occurred over Liston's long career. Perhaps he did accidentally cut an assistant on one occasion. Perhaps a spectator did faint or have a heart attack at another. Perhaps he did tear a college coat. Over time, these separate incidents could have been woven together into one single, spectacular narrative. The proponents of the story, on the other hand, argue that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. They suggest that a disaster this embarrassing might have been deliberately covered up. Liston was a powerful figure at University College Hospital. He and his colleagues might have suppressed the story to avoid a scandal that would have damaged the hospital's reputation. They also point out that hospital record-keeping in the 1840s was notoriously haphazard. The fact that we can't find a record doesn't definitively prove it didn't happen. And here's a quirky little fact about historical research: the power of a good story. Historians are human. And a great anecdote is incredibly seductive. The 300% mortality story is so perfect, so illustrative, that it's tempting to believe it's true. It has what historians call narrative coherence. It just feels right. It neatly encapsulates the era's blend of brilliance and brutality. This very appeal makes it harder to debunk. People want it to be true. So, what is the consensus among academic historians today? There isn't one. It remains a live controversy. Most serious medical historians will now present the story with a heavy dose of caution. They'll use phrases like "according to legend," or "it is famously," if perhaps apocryphal lie, reported that. They acknowledge its power as a parable about the dangers of surgical ego, but they stop short of stating it as undisputed fact. The debate boils down to a fundamental question of historical evidence. Do we trust the enduring power of a well-told oral tradition? Or do we trust only what is written down and verifiable at the time? So as you stand in the quiet of the archives, you're left with a fascinating puzzle. The story of the 300% mortality rate surgery might be the truest lie in medical history. It may not have happened exactly as told, but it tells a profound truth about the world of Robert Liston, a world where speed was king, where surgeons were superstars, and where a single moment of unchecked ambition could lead to unimaginable disaster. The legend is, in a way, more important than the reality. It's the cautionary tale that has echoed down the centuries, a permanent reminder of the fine line between genius and recklessness. Whether the 300% mortality surgery was fact or folklore, it has come to unfairly define Robert Liston's entire career. It's such a powerful, macabre story that it overshadows everything else he accomplished. But, if we push the legend aside for a moment and look at the historical record, a different, more complex picture of the man emerges. Liston wasn't just a slasher or reckless showman. He was also a genuine innovator and a dedicated teacher who made significant, lasting contributions to the field of surgery. Let's step away from the operating theater and imagine you're in a hospital ward, watching Liston on his rounds. He's not performing now, he's teaching. You see him stop at the bedside of a patient with a fractured femur. The standard treatment at the time was often crude and ineffective, leaving patients with permanently shortened or misaligned legs. But Liston is demonstrating a new technique. He is applying what would come to be known as the Liston splint. This was a long, straight wooden splint designed to keep the leg completely immobilized from the armpit to the foot. It was simple, effective, and a major improvement over previous methods. It helped to reduce pain, prevent further injury, and promote better healing. This wasn't a flashy, theatrical invention. It was a practical, patient-focused innovation born from a deep understanding of anatomy and a desire to improve outcomes. He wasn't just interested in the dramatic moment of cutting, he was invested in the long, slow process of healing. Now move to another part of the hospital. You see Liston examining a patient with a dislocated jaw. Again, the common methods for dealing with this were often brutal and involved a great deal of force. Liston, however, developed a specific technique for relocation that was more elegant and less traumatic for the patient. He was a thinker, a problem solver. Perhaps his most important contributions, however, were in the tools he designed and modified. We've met the Liston knife, built for speed, but he also developed or refined other instruments. A key example is the bulldog-locking forceps. These were small, strong forceps with a self-locking mechanism, designed to clamp onto an artery and stay shut without the surgeon needing to hold them. This was a crucial innovation. It freed up the surgeon's hands during a complex procedure and provided a more reliable way of controlling bleeding than fumbling with ligatures in a deep, bloody wound. It was a small change that made a huge difference. And here's a lesser-known fact that speaks to his forward-thinking nature. Liston was an early adopter of the stethoscope. This instrument had been invented in France in 1860, but many British physicians were slow, even resistant, to using it, preferring their traditional methods of thumping the chest and listening with an unaided ear. Liston, however, embraced the new technology, recognizing its value in diagnosis. It shows a mind that was open to new ideas, not just one stuck in the old ways of cutting. So why has this side of Liston been so thoroughly eclipsed by his reputation for speed? This is a question that fascinates historians of science and medicine. How is a historical figure's legacy created? It seems that a single, dramatic story, especially a negative one, has far more power in the popular imagination than a dozen small, incremental, positive contributions. The 300% mortality story is simply more memorable than the Liston splint. It's a better story. Historians argue about whether this is a fair process. Should we judge historical figures by their most sensational alleged failures, or by the totality of their work? There's a constant tension between the complex, nuanced reality of a person's life and the simplified, often cartoonish, version that gets passed down through history. Liston was a man of his time. He was arrogant, short-tempered, and operated within a brutal and flawed system. But he was not a one-dimensional caricature. He was a dedicated teacher who trained a generation of surgeons. He was a thoughtful inventor whose practical solutions improved patient care. He wrote influential textbooks, like Practical Surgery and Elements of Surgery, which were standard reference works for years. These achievements are the quieter, less dramatic parts of his legacy, but they are none less real. They show a man who was deeply engaged with the science of his profession, constantly seeking ways to make surgery better, safer, and more effective. As you reflect on this other side of Liston, you realize that judging him solely by his speed is like judging a musician by how fast they can play the scales, while ignoring the beauty and complexity of the music they create. His speed was just one facet of a much more complicated and brilliant career. And, as fate would have it, the very quality that made him famous, his speed, was about to be rendered obsolete by a revolutionary discovery from across the ocean. While Liston is in London, cementing his legacy as the fastest knife in the West End, a quiet revolution is brewing thousands of miles away in the United States. It doesn't arrive with a bang or a flash of steel, but with a strange, sweet smell and the promise of a dreamless sleep. It's a discovery that will fundamentally change everything about surgery. And in doing so, wishing you a pleasant experience will make Robert Liston's most celebrated skill almost irrelevant. Let's transport you for a moment to Boston, Massachusetts. On October 16, you are in an operating theater very similar to Liston's. At Massachusetts General Hospital, a dentist named William G. Morton is about to administer a mysterious vapor to a patient who needs a tumor removed from his neck. The surgeon, John Collins Warren, is skeptical. He has seen countless failed attempts at pain relief before. The patient breathes from a glass globe filled with a sponge soaked in a chemical. After a few minutes, he appears to fall asleep. The theater is silent, tense. Warren turns to the audience and famously quips, "As Dr. Morton has not arrived, I presume he is otherwise engaged, showing his doubt. Just then Morton arrives, and the procedure begins. Warren makes the first incision. The crowd leans forward, expecting the inevitable scream. But it doesn't come. The patient lies still, breathing peacefully. He does not flinch. He does not cry out. Warren continues the operation, dissecting the tumor with a care and deliberation that would have been impossible just minutes earlier. When he is finished, he turns to the stunned audience and utters one of the most famous lines in medical history, gentlemen. This is no humbug. The substance was sulfuric ether, and it worked. For the first time, a patient had undergone a major surgical procedure without feeling any pain. The news spread like wildfire. It crossed the Atlantic with the speed of a steamship, arriving in London in December of that same year. Imagine the reaction in the London medical community. It would have been a mixture of wild excitement and deep skepticism. For centuries, the holy grail of surgery had been the conquest of pain. They had tried everything: opium, alcohol, mesmerism, hypnosis, even compressing the nerves leading to the limb. Nothing had truly worked. The idea that a simple inhaled vapor could achieve what centuries of effort had failed to do must have seemed like a miracle, or a hoax. And who would be the first surgeon in Britain to try this revolutionary new technique in a public operation? It had to be the biggest name in the game. It had to be Robert Liston. He was the star, the innovator, the man with the confidence to embrace such a radical new idea. The stage was set for what would be, in its own way, an even more dramatic performance than any of his high-speed amputations. Here's a curious little fact about the discovery of anesthesia. The recreational use of ether and nitrous oxide laughing gas was already well known. For years, people had been attending ether frolics or laughing gas parties, where they would inhale the vapors for their intoxicating and euphoric effects. The anesthetic properties were right there, hiding in plain sight. The genius of men like Morton and Crawford Long, who used it earlier but didn't publish, was not in discovering the chemical, but in making the intellectual leap to apply its effects to a medical problem. It's a classic example of a scientific breakthrough happening when someone sees an old thing in a new way. The imminent arrival of ether in London sparked a fierce debate, one that historians still analyze. How did the surgical community react to a technology that threatened to upend their entire professional identity? For surgeons like Liston, their fame, their status, their very claim to greatness was built on their ability to operate with incredible speed through the patient's pain. Speed was their superpower. What would it mean to be a great surgeon in a world where speed was no longer the primary virtue? Some historians argue that there was significant resistance from old-school surgeons, who felt that anesthesia was unmanly or that pain was a necessary part of the healing process. Others contend that most surgeons, having witnessed the horrors of conscious surgery firsthand, embraced it with open arms and immense relief. The truth is likely a mix of both. It was a paradigm shift, and like all such shifts, it was met with both excitement and fear. On December 21, just 2 months after the Boston demonstration, a patient named Frederick Churchill was wheeled into the operating theater at University College Hospital. He needed his leg amputated. Robert Liston was waiting. But this time, next to the usual array of knives and saws, there was a new piece of equipment, a strange-looking inhaler device, brought by a young dentist. The crowd was bigger than ever. They were about to witness the dawn of a new age. The age of painless surgery had arrived in London, and the fastest knife in the West End was about to preside over its birth. You are back in the familiar, crowded operating theater at University College Hospital. The date is December 21, The air is electric, but for a completely different reason than before. The usual morbid tension is replaced by a sense of profound, historic anticipation. Today, the main attraction isn't the speed of the knife, but the magic of the ether. The patient, Frederick Churchill, the butler, is on the table. He looks just as frightened as any patient you've seen before. He knows he is a guinea pig in a grand experiment. Liston is there, a commanding presence as always, but today he shares the stage. Next to him is a dentist named James Robinson, who has constructed an inhaler based on the descriptions from America. It's a simple apparatus, a glass vessel with a tube. Liston, ever the showman, addresses the packed gallery. He explains what is about to be attempted. You can hear the skepticism in some corners, the excited whispers in others. He then nods to Robinson. The procedure begins not with a knife, but with a quiet hiss as the ether is administered. Robinson places the tube in Churchill's mouth and encourages him to breathe deeply. The theater is silent. Everyone watches the patient. For a minute, nothing seems to happen. Then, Churchill's breathing becomes deeper, more regular. His eyes, which had been wide with fear, flutter and then close. His body, which had been rigid with tension, relaxes. He appears to have fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. Liston steps forward. He performs a quick chest, pinching the patient's skin. There is no reaction. He lifts the arm and lets it fall. It drops limply to the side. He looks out at the audience, a flicker of genuine astonishment on his own face. Then he picks up his knife. He looks at his pocket watch, not to be timed for speed, but simply to mark the moment. He turns to the gallery and says one word now. He begins the amputation. The Liston knife flashes, making the circular incisions. The saw comes out. The familiar, horrible sounds of cutting and sawing fill the room. But one sound is completely deafening, lives up the scream. Churchill does not move. He does not flinch. He does not make a sound. He is completely still, lost in an ethereal slumber. The surgeons and students in the audience are spellbound. They are witnessing the impossible. They are watching a major amputation being performed on a man who might as well be resting in his own bed. The procedure is transformed, without the patient threshing and screaming. Liston himself seems different. The frenetic, violent energy is gone. He is able to work with a calm, unhurried deliberation that no one has ever seen from him before. He takes his time, carefully dissecting the tissues, lighting the vessels with precision. The entire amputation takes 28 seconds, even with the luxury of a motionless patient. Liston's incredible speed is still on display. It's a habit too deeply ingrained to abandon. But the meaning of that speed has changed. It's no longer a race against pain, but a display of pure, unadulterated skill. When it's over, and the stump is bandaged, Churchill is gently roused. He slowly opens his eyes, looking around in a daze. He asks when the operation is going to begin. The room erupts. The students are stamping their feet and cheering. The tension breaks into a wave of euphoric celebration. Liston, the master of the Screaming Theatre, has just presided over its first silent performance. After the operation, he is reported to have turned to his colleagues and said, his gruff voice filled with emotion, "This Yankee Dodge, gentlemen, beats mesmerism hollow." Here's a small, poignant detail from that day. After the procedure, the amputated leg was, as was customary, taken to the pathology lab. The medical students, in their excitement, followed it. Later, they intercepted Frederick Churchill as he was being wheeled back to the ward and, in a moment of celebratory camaraderie, made him shake hands with his own severed leg. It's a bizarre, macabre image, but it speaks to the giddy, revolutionary atmosphere of the day. The old horrors had been vanquished, and the relief was so great it bordered on delirious. The success of this operation is a major turning point, not just in medicine, but in Liston's own story. How did this feel for him? This is a subject of endless fascination for his biographers. On one hand, it was a moment of supreme triumph. He had once again proven himself to be at the forefront of surgical innovation. On the other hand, it must have been a profoundly strange experience. The core skill that had defined his entire identity, the ability to be faster than pain, had just been rendered obsolete. He was like a cavalry officer witnessing the invention of the tank. His particular form of bravery was no longer the most important virtue. Historians debate whether he felt a sense of personal obsolescence, or simply the pride of being the man who ushered in the new age. In that moment, the fastest knife in the West End willingly participated in his own professional extinction. The era of the slasher, the performer, the man who raced the clock, was over. He had given the world of surgery its greatest gift, silence. It was, in many ways, his finest hour. It was also his last great public act. The first knife had taken its final blow. The silence that fell over Liston's operating theatre on that December day echoed across the world. The news of successful anesthetic surgery in London legitimized the Yankee Dodge and accelerated its adoption everywhere. The era of screaming was over, and with that, the very nature of surgery began a profound and irreversible transformation. You can feel the shift in the atmosphere almost immediately. The operating theatre, once a stage for a high-speed drama of endurance, starts to become something else. It's no longer a place for spectacle, but for science. The clock on the wall, once the ultimate arbiter of a surgeon's skill, begins to lose its power. With the patient still and silent, the frantic need for speed evaporates. And in its place, a new virtue emerges: meticulousness. Surgeons no longer have to be whirlwinds of motion. They can be careful. They can take their time. A 10-minute operation is no longer failure. It might be a sign of a more thoughtful, precise practitioner. The surgeon can now pause, think, and carefully dissect tissues, identifying nerves and blood vessels with a precision that was unthinkable before. The entire craft shifts from a bloody sprint to a delicate marathon. This change had a ripple effect on every aspect of the profession. Surgical techniques became more complex and ambitious. Procedures that were once considered impossible because they simply took too long were now on the table. Surgeons could now venture into the great cavities of the body: the abdomen, the chest, the skull, with a degree of safety and control they had never had before. It was the dawn of modern invasive surgery. The focus was no longer just on amputation and surface-level problems, it was on fixing things deep inside the human body. The tools changed, too. The heavy, brutal IST instruments designed for speed and force began to be replaced by more delicate, specialized tools. The surgeon's toolkit started to look less like a carpenter's box and more like a watchmaker's. The emphasis shifted from brute strength to fine motor control. The ideal surgeon was no longer the brawny, 6-foot giant like Liston, but someone with nimble fingers and immense patience. And here's a subtle but important consequence of this shift: it changed the sound of the hospital. The screams from the operating theatre had been a constant, accepted part of hospital life. Their absence was a profound change, but it also, ironically, highlighted the sounds of the other great killer, the groans and cries from the fever wards. Patients were now surviving the surgeon's knife in ever greater numbers, only to die of infection days later. The success of anesthesia through the failure of hygiene into stark relief. It solved one half of the surgical problem, making the other half, the problem of post-operative infection, all the more glaring and urgent. This relationship between anesthesia and the subsequent development of antiseptic surgery is a key point of discussion for medical historians. Did the former directly lead to the latter? The argument is compelling. With patients surviving longer and undergoing more complex internal surgeries, the death toll from infection became even more catastrophic and undeniable. Anesthesia gave surgeons the time to perform more intricate operations, but it also gave bacteria more time and opportunity to invade the body. Some historians argue that without the revolution in pain control, the revolution in germ control, led by figures like Joseph Liston, no relation to Liston to decades later, might have been delayed. Anesthesia created a new set of problems that demanded a new solution, thus pushing the science forward. It's a fascinating example of how one breakthrough can illuminate the need for another. The very identity of the surgeon was remade. The slasher persona, the theatrical showman, became an anachronism. The new ideal was the calm, quiet, scientific practitioner. The swagger was replaced by solemnity. The operating theatre ceased to be a public spectacle and gradually became the private, sterile sanctuary we know today. The audience disappeared, replaced by a small, dedicated team. The performance became a procedure. Robert Liston stood right on the cusp of this change. He was the ultimate embodiment of the old school. the master of a craft that was rendered obsolete in his own lifetime. He was a man perfectly suited for the brutal world of pre-anesthetic surgery, but his particular set of skills was no longer the most valuable currency. It's a poignant end to his story arc. He was the king of the old world, and he personally opened the door to the new one, a world in which he would no longer be king. The science of surgery, thanks in large part to the science he helped to introduce, was finally ready to move beyond the man. So, where does this leave our protagonist? Robert Liston. He stands as a figure caught between two worlds, the last great hero of the old age and the reluctant herald of the new. How do we, from the comfort of our quiet, painless century, pass judgment on such a man? What is his ultimate legacy? His career after that famous first anesthetic surgery was surprisingly short. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his profession, but he wouldn't live long to see the world he helped create. In December 1847, just under a year after he introduced ether to the British surgical theatre, Robert Liston died suddenly. The cause was a ruptured aortic aneurysm. He was only 53 years old. His death was sudden, shocking, and in a way, poetically timed. He died at the very peak of his fame, before his skills could be fully eclipsed by the new era of careful, deliberate surgery, whose legacy, therefore, is a tangled one. In the popular imagination, he is often frozen in time as the reckless, blood-soaked showman, the man of the 300% mortality rate. This version of Liston serves as a convenient bogeyman, a symbol of everything that was barbaric and wrong about Victorian medicine. He becomes a caricature, a monstrous figure from a less enlightened time, making it easier for us to appreciate our own medical progress. But the historical Liston is far more nuanced. To his students and many of his patients, he was a genuine hero. He was the man you went to when all the hope was lost. His speed, which we might see as reckless, was, to them, a form of mercy. He saved countless lives through his decisive skill and his willingness to take on cases that other surgeons deemed hopeless. His innovations, like the Liston splint in the bulldog forceps, were not the flashy work of a showman but the practical contributions of a dedicated healer. These are the parts of his legacy that are often lost in the shadow of his more sensational exploits. Then there is his role as an educator. He was a founding surgeon at University College Hospital, a new type of institution that sought to separate medical education from religious doctrine. He was a passionate teacher who helped to shape a new generation of British surgeons, instilling in them his deep respect for anatomy and his practical, no-nonsense approach to the craft. This is a quiet legacy, one that doesn't make for a thrilling story, but it was arguably one of his most important and lasting impacts. Here's a small, chilling anecdote about the end of his life. Shortly before he died, he was consulted on the case of a young woman with a large tumor on her neck. It was a dangerous, complex operation that other surgeons had refused to attempt. Liston, even in the new age of anesthesia, believed he was the only one with the skill and nerve to do it. He was preparing to perform the surgery when he suffered his fatal aneurysm. The story shows that, to the very end, his core identity remained unchanged. He was the surgeon of last resort, the man who would step in when others were afraid. The debate over Liston's legacy continues to this day among historians. Was he a forward-thinking pioneer who pushed the boundaries of his profession? Or was he a relic of a bygone era? A dinosaur whose methods were already becoming obsolete? The most compelling argument is that he was both. He was a transitional figure. He perfected the art of pre-anesthetic surgery, taking it to its absolute zenith of speed and efficiency. And then, by championing anesthesia, he rendered his own primary skill set redundant. He was the bridge between the old world and the new. You can think of him as the last gunslinger in the Wild West. His legendary speed with a knife was like a gunslinger's fast draw. It was a skill born of a violent and lawless environment. But when civilization arrived in the form of anesthesia, that particular skill was no longer the most important one. A new set of laws, a new set of virtues, came to govern the territory. Liston was the fastest draw of his time, But he also lived long enough to see the arrival of the telegraph and the railroad, technologies that would change his world forever. His story is a powerful reminder that history is not a simple line of progress from bad to good. It's a messy, complicated process, full of brilliant, flawed individuals who are both products of their time and agents of its change. Robert Liston was not a monster, nor was he a perfect saint of science. He was a man of immense talent and immense ego, who saved many lives and, according to legend, ended a few in spectacular fashion. His enduring legacy is this very complexity, a perfect case study in the dramatic, brutal, and revolutionary world of 19th century surgery. And so, our journey through the noisy, bloody, and brilliant world of Robert Liston comes to a close. We leave him in 1847, frozen in time by his sudden death, forever the master of a forgotten art. It's time for you to step out of the 19th century and back into your own quiet room. The journey back is instantaneous. One moment you're in the gaslit gloom of Victorian London. The next you're surrounded by the familiar comforts of the present. Take a moment. Listen to the silence. There are no screams from a nearby hospital. There is no clatter of iron wheels on cobblestones. The air you breathe is clean, free from the heavy miasma of coal smoke and disease. You can feel the gentle hum of electricity, a force that would have seemed like pure magic in Liston's time. Think about the scrape on your hand, the one you got at the very beginning of our story. In Liston's world, it was a potential death sentence. No, it's a trivial nuisance. You have access to clean water, soap, antiseptic wipes, and adhesive bandages. If by some slim chance it did become infected, a course of antibiotics, a true miracle that would have saved nearly everyone in that 19th century fever ward, would cure it up in a matter of days. You live your life surrounded by an invisible shield of medical knowledge that was built, piece by painful piece, by the trials and errors of people like Liston. The world of surgery he inhabited feels like a distant, alien planet. The idea of a public operation, of a surgeon holding a bloody knife in his teeth, of a 300% mortality rated, all seems like the stuff of a gothic horror novel. But it was real. It was the price of ignorance. It was the brutal reality that humanity had to pass through to get to where we are now. The story of Robert Liston is, in the end, a story about the relentless pursuit of better. Liston pursued a better surgery through speed. He thought that if he could just be faster, he could beat pain and shock. He was wrong, or at least, only partially right. The real better came from an entirely different direction, from the quiet magic of anesthesia, and then, from the invisible science of antiseptics, pioneered by Joseph Lister, who built upon the silence that anesthesia provided. Each step was a reaction to the failures of the last. Here's one final, fascinating piece of trivia that connects the eras. The operating theatre where Liston performed the first anesthetic surgery in Britain still exists. It's now a university lecture hall, but the original architectural features are preserved. Students sit in the same steep stands where the horrified and amazed spectators of 1846 once sat. It's a quiet, model room, used for lectures on literature or law, but if you stand in that space, you can almost feel the ghosts of the past. You can almost hear the echo of a scream. And then, the profound, world-changing silence that followed it. This journey with Liston is a powerful reminder of how quickly our reality can change, and how much we take for granted. We stand on a mountain of accumulated knowledge, and it's easy to forget the immense struggle and sacrifice it took to build it. The men and women who lay on those operating tables, the anonymous patients who screamed and suffered and died, were the unwilling pioneers. Their suffering was the data that slowly, painfully, lead to a better world. And so we say farewell to the screams. We say farewell to the blood-soaked coat and the frantic race against the clock. We leave Robert Liston, the fastest knife in the West End, to his complicated and noisy legend. His era is over. The silence he helped to usher in has become our normal, and it's a silence we should never, ever take for granted. It is the sound of one of humanity's greatest victories. The city outside your window is quiet now. The frantic energy of the day has softened into the slow, steady rhythm of the night. The journey we took together, back to that noisy, smoky, and dangerous past, feels like a distant dream already. The sharp, coppery scent of blood and the phantom sound of a saw and bone have faded, replaced by the gentle hum of your fan and the soft weight of your blanket. You can let go of that world now. Let the cobblestone streets dissolve. Let the gas lights flicker and die out. Let the imposing figure of Robert Liston, with his fierce eyes and his legendary speed, bow and exit the stage of your mind. He belongs to history now, a ghost in a blood-stained coat, his story told. Your own body feels heavy, relaxed. Your breathing is slow and deep, a peaceful tide pulling you further and further away from the shore of wakefulness. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed. There are no miasmas in the air, no invisible killers lurking in a simple scratch. There is only stillness and the profound comfort of the present moment. You can allow your thoughts to become like clouds, drifting aimlessly across the dark sky of your mind, before dissolving into nothing at all. You are drifting now, floating on a quiet river that flows gently toward the vast, silent ocean of sleep. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to think about. Just rest. The end of the article. Good night.